I'm talking to you. Let's have everyone back to their seats and get the next interactive session happening. So, how have we gone so far? Ladies, gentlemen, all good? Not too boring? Keeping you awake? Good to hear. Trevor Band, come back to your table. Okay, let's get the next session happening. We've got Neil giving us an interactive session again, as we've already established. That last session was excellent. We had some good input from the floor. We had some good input from our industry colleagues. So I'll hand over to Assistant Ops Manager Neil Schaefer, and off we go.
Thanks, Neil. Good day, everybody, and thanks very much for attending this year's CFI Conference. Last year, as you remember, we had our inaugural CFI Conference, and it was a success, and I think everybody took something away from it. One of the things that we did do last year was we announced and introduced the new operations manual. One of the advantages of the operations manual last year, and we stated in the structure, is that we were able to remove the syllabus. And by removing the syllabus, it gives us much more flexibility as an organisation, a training organisation, to actually modify and change elements of the syllabus as required. We are living very much now in a dynamic environment. Except not dynamic enough for me. So today we want to have a talk about the syllabus, and it is, as Jill pointed out, an interactive session. We have got a unique opportunity this year, and when we get the amount of knowledge and instructional experience and delivery in the room, to sit down and discuss openly the elements of the syllabus that are working. Remember, the syllabus at the end of the day is the backbone of the skill sets that we're delivering to our pilots. Those are the skill sets, the fundamental tools that we give our pilots in order to be successful for every flight. Behind that, of course, sits a very important layer of human factors and decision making. We're going to talk more about that over the next 2 days. And we could talk about it with regards to the syllabus. But what I want to do is I want to open up some discussion about the syllabus. And I want to ask some questions to promote some discussion amongst the group. So what we'll do is we'll open up a couple of areas, and then I want to hand it out to the groups and have some discussion as to what we need to do. But let's provocate for a start. Are we covering in the RAL syllabus? And remember, we've got a number of syllabus items. We've got across 3 different groups. Are we covering what's needed? What has changed in terms of our training environments and the things that we need to cover from a syllabus point of view? And are we just delivering the syllabus for the purpose of completing an exercise and thereby just giving somebody a single dimensional training experience, or which we'd call rote in a way? Or are we, and is the syllabus catering for us to deliver true understanding of a flight element? Are we equipping the pilot with the ability to be able to take that skill set and use it across a range of variables? And at the end of the day, if we say that we are doing that, how do we as individual instructors determine competency? So let's just open up on those subjects at the moment, and let's just have a start. How do we determine competency as an instructor, and what is our guide? Nobody knows? Ken, you turned away quick enough. How do you determine competency in an element in a flight exercise?
So, Ken Flower from Narrabri. Competency, you determine it by observing that the competency is delivered, and how do we know whether it's delivered well enough? Is it within the bounds of the syllabus, the range of delivery that can be had for that level of pilot?
Good. So we look at the element and we decide whether or not the pilot can meet the requirements. So let's talk about a rate one or just a gentle turn. So when we ask a pilot can he perform a gentle turn, we're looking for a number of key elements, aren't we? do we actually break down those elements and do we refer them back, firstly, to the effects and controls lesson, to the basic parts of the element? Do we reinforce the previous learning in that exercise? And then we look across the range of variables. Do we look at the elements where we use gentle turns and how we use them, and then cross-pollinate that idea in different phases of flight? And does the syllabus actually give us enough capacity at the moment? Because one of the things I get the advantage of doing is I get to fly with a lot of pilots and I get to fly with a lot of instructors. So you guys get to teach, and you probably get to fly with a lot of your own product, and you develop your own product, and you may cross-assess some of your own instructors' products. But I'm in a fortunate position, because of what I do with the organisation, to fly with a lot of different byproducts, the students, and also a lot of instructors. And I see a huge diversity. And the most common thing I get from pilots is that I was never taught that, or nobody's ever explained that to me. Or when I had one only last week, and somebody said, yeah, I did that, but I didn't really know if I was in control of the aeroplane. So in terms of the syllabus, we've got it written down. We've got an element written down, whether it be climbing at best rate, best angle, or whatever. But how do we actually make sure that we get to that level? Any other thoughts? Yes, Peter?
Well, with you mentioned your rate 1 turn. So you mentioned just doing a rate 1 turn. So if you're the CFI and you're taking your students through this, it's a matter of not just showing them in calm conditions, showing them in every condition, making sure that you're assessing and breaking it down. Threat error management's a big thing in that. You go right through the whole process, and at the end of the day, when you're up there assessing them after that lesson's complete, or many other lessons are complete, and you're assessing them, you're hands off and you're just using your skill set watching them to make sure that they can do that rate 1 turn or whatever manoeuvre it is. And at that point, you should be able to say, well, they're competent. So the syllabus is there as a guideline for you, but the syllabus can't be the point of interest that's going to be in the aircraft with you at the time. So that's your CFI or your instructor that has to be competent enough to follow that skill set through and be understanding enough that when in the various conditions that the pilot's flying in or your student is flying in, that you're satisfied that by the time it comes to the end of his training and you're about to issue him with his pilot certificate, that you're happy and you take him through that due process. You're sitting in the aircraft and he's showing you everything you've taught him. He's basically a mini you.
Excellent, thanks very much, Peter. And look, Peter just hit on a very important, two important points there. One is range of variables. Now, we don't talk about it a lot in the REL syllabus. It's very much talked about in the Part 61 MOS. We talk about putting a student through a range of situations to demonstrate their competency in that element. And a number of different spheres: a gliding gentle turn, a climbing gentle turn, a gentle turn in an emergency, a gentle turn in a crosswind. So we're looking at referencing to ground movement drift versus the ability to fly the aircraft in the airspace that it's in. So range of variables and different environments is one way to cross-triangulate whether or not we're developing that skill where it's robust. And we see evidence of non-robust skills come to light in emergency situations. So the ability to actually look at a syllabus item and actually say, well, that's okay, I've taught him how to turn, and he can do a medium turn or a gentle turn, or he can climb the aircraft at best rate. But have I looked at a number of different ways in which that's applied, with my experience in flight, to determine whether or not the pilot or the student truly understands? Because what we're trying to teach at the end of the day is not rote, we're trying to teach understanding. And if we can give a man a fish, we'll only teach him for a day. But if we can teach a man to fish, he can feed himself for a lifetime. So effectively, that's what we're looking at. And what I'm asking in the syllabus at the moment, while we have an opportunity to review the syllabus, is what are the elements that maybe need some massaging? For example, at the moment there's a high migration rate for young pilots particularly that are using the RPC to move up to the RPL. We've got how many combined schools here that operate 141 or ASC operations? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Would that be a fair comment from the room that we are starting to see a fair bit of convergence in the requirements, Paul?
Most assuredly.
Yeah. Are we seeing deficiencies in the current syllabus at the 3-axis level that may be limiting or hampering their ability to seamlessly move on to an RPL or even a higher qualification?
I think If there are deficiencies, we're only noting them in the procedural elements.
G'day, Paul McEwen from Gympie. We run a combined RA-GA school, and you're right, Neil, more and more young people now with the RPL pathway are looking to the RPC, as we're now calling it, to move up through into potential career in aviation. So it's good for our organisation. It's a whole new class of member that's coming through. Whilst we always had a little trickle of this, I think the trickle's going to turn into a flood. You can see that now by a lot of the well-established GA schools starting to pick up an RAL's facility. My observation in the conversion process so far is that physical skill set in terms of flying aeroplanes is very good. We should be proud of ourselves for that. The limitations are starting to become obvious in some of the procedural areas and knowledge of air law and so forth. So perhaps there's some areas where we could do a bit more work.
Thanks, Paul. General agreement with that? Okay, so obviously one of the things that you're aware of that's Jill and I are charged with is the investigation in the development for a CTA endorsement and to give access for our pilots to control airspace. Clearly the range of variables and the performance variables that we need to make sure that our pilots are capable of flying at in day VFR need to meet those similar requirements that are going to give them those privileges. So if we don't start with that basics, a set of standards, and the student may not even be aware. Does he know that he has to fly within plus or minus 150 feet or plus or minus 5 degrees? Do we explain in terms of what's expected in terms of competency what we would measure? Or is it sort of like, yeah, look, you did really well today and yet you've got your pilot certificate, here's a handshake, thanks very much. How do they know what are the areas of competency? So they're the questions that I wanted to raise in terms of competency, and also any other thoughts about our integration and also maybe our disintegration, where we need to move away from complexity of syllabus to simplicity. How many parachute operators do we have in the room? Weight shift trike operators? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I guess would it be fair to say from our weight shift community that some of the requirements that have been overlaid from the 3-axis syllabus and almost mimicked into the Group B syllabus are probably superfluous, and there may be some areas that are inappropriate? Yes? No? So what we want to hear is the sort of things that we can do to change that. What could we pull out of, say, the Group B syllabus and insert that's more appropriate to the development? Because Group B microlights and powered parachutes to a lesser degree are starting to show up higher in terms of our accident. And of course, they don't have the protection mechanisms in terms of serious accidents, so the consequences of that risk is a much greater, more potential for a serious accident or a fatal. And we've seen a number of those, unfortunately, in recent times. So what are the elements that we could change in the Group B syllabus from a weight shift point of view? Have you thought about it? Is there something in the syllabus at the moment you've gone, look, that's just crazy, I'm going to teach that differently?
Well, the problem is that the syllabus basically is only structured towards 3-axis.
And that's the question I'm provocating. If it's structured towards 3-axis, how can we change it to be more effective and more realistic for Group B?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, we're working through that. We've done our own sort of sectional part of the syllabus. So we work on that and change that slightly. But a lot of the standard syllabus is quite okay. But when you're talking about effective aileron, well, of course we're not using ailerons. So you just drop that. You just drop that out. Yeah. So but it's general. I mean, really the syllabus is fine. But for the CFI or weight shift aircraft, we have to modify it ourselves. Hopefully when you finish that Class B syllabus, that will reflect what we need compared to Class A. Don't forget a lot of the Class B CFIs are also Class A people as well.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. The pilot-induced oscillation. A pendulous aircraft has got a much higher level of relevance to pendulous effect than a Group A or a 3-axis aircraft does, because we don't have that natural stability of a tailplane. So we've got that issue. So the other thing I wanted to talk about Next slide. I often see, and we see evidence where while the syllabus is being taught, we're seeing, for example, the syllabus is being trained to type. So somebody specifically becomes very comfortable at training the specific type aircraft, and they may limit the training that's provided to the student based on that aircraft type. That may have to do with the characteristics of the aircraft, but the question is are we training the pilot to fly just a Tecnam or a Jabiru or a Sling, or are we teaching them to fly a 3-axis aircraft across the envelope? Because we don't know where they're going to go. They will probably go on to fly hopefully a number of aircraft and may end up buying one at some stage. But are we teaching, and I see evidence of people who will not side slip aircraft because they say, well, it doesn't behave well in the side slip, so I just won't do it. And then we see them go and buy things like Savannahs or Foxbats, and then they're trying to get themselves, or placed in an emergency situation where they haven't really been able to develop that. So within the syllabus, are we teaching just to a set of generic skill sets that can be embraced and further developed, or are we only teaching to specific types or locations, for example? Some airport and aerodrome or training school operations have specific requirements for overfly heights, and so, or recently I assessed a pilot and I asked him to rejoin the circuit as part of his pilot assessment, and I was expecting him to do an overhead join to show me that he could triangulate and look at the wind cycle and do all the stuff and basically apply what would be outlined in Cap 166, and we did 3 base joins. And I asked the pilot, and it was under examination, I said, well, why are we doing base joins? How come you didn't? Oh, we don't fly over the top here because they're parachute. So is that student pilot going to be competent to go to a fly-in where you would expect him, to, with the extra mitigation of safety, to do an overhead join? So there was a classic case of a pilot that was being taught to location, yet the syllabus calls for all range of variables to be explored. So that's a question I want to provoke. And can you think of any examples where that might be true in your, or that you're aware of yourself? Ken?
Yeah, Ken Flower again from Narrabri. Look, I think it's very important to look at what the risks are involved, and I think we've absolutely got to teach a flying system, because whilst we're teaching someone on type, it's got to be a flying system that suits them as a pilot and gives them the framework. And I think in RAIs, just like when we convert people to light aircraft, we look at the specific risks associated with it. When we're training them, especially now that we've got so many going on to get RPLs and CPLs, we've really got to look at what a specific problem we've got. And so one of the things that I note is flying a Rotax engine without a carby heat. I think it's imperative on us that we teach carby heat in all of our checklists, emergency and pre-takeoff, even though we don't have it. And I think it's very important to teach your students that, you know, in this aircraft, the undercarriage is down and locked. I just find that sometimes I hear people say, downwind, undercarriage down and locked, undercarriage is always locked. No, it's locked on this particular aircraft, and put your finger on it. So I think from day one, we've got to let them know that we're teaching a system of training, and in RAIs specifically, we've got to, I think, watch out for not teaching carby heat, because it will catch them if they don't learn it from the first 30 or 40 hours of flying.
Good, thanks very much, Ken. Anything else? Yes, Bill. Off you go then.
Okay, Bill Grieve, and I operate a beer where I'm a sole operator and only operate in one kind of aircraft, namely a Savannah. But I agree that I try to teach my students always, I say to them that I am training you to fly, not to fly a Savannah. But that becomes very difficult. I choose to use as many different airfields as I can in the area to give them experience at left-hand circuits, right-hand circuits, proper joins on strain circuits and so on. But when it comes to teaching things like undercarriage down and carb heat, which I don't use in the Savannah because it's totally ineffective, I had to make a decision on this, and I started to talk to my students and came up with the fact that it's a little bit like a boy crying wolf. If I keep telling them to say undercarriage down and hitting a button that it doesn't exist, after a while they're going to start to believe that it doesn't mean anything. I think they're going to learn that when they do type training for a particular aircraft. Now, I might be wrong, and I'm happy to be told I'm wrong, because a lot of people have got a lot more experience than I have, but that's my feeling on it, and I think it's worth considering.
Thanks, Bill. So another question I wanted to ask, and we talked other than the RPL standards, is has the intent of type training that was introduced in the Ops Manual in version 7, has it been clearly understood and identified for you CFIs? Do you understand, and we've had a number of calls when it initially was brought out, of the definition of what determines a different type is. So I just want to ask that question of the group. Have you had any challenges in terms of trying to understand what a different type is from a guidance point of view, or is it very clear to you what our intention is for operations in terms of training to a different type and the requirements? Yes.
Hi, my name's Tony from Royal Queensland Aero Club. I had a question from a RAOS pilot regarding recency, and this question of type came up. We fly a sling, and that's what he flies, a 3-axis group. And he had recent takeoffs and landings in the past 90 days in a 206 and also a 172. But he hadn't had 3 takeoffs and landings in the sling in 90 days, and he asked me the question, am I recent to go flying? And I wasn't sure, because there are issues. It's true, they're both 3-axis, they're all 3-axis control aeroplanes, it flies the same way. But also there's the issues of, I guess, design features. Well, design features he's fine, because fixed gear, fixed pitch. But there's also the inertia issue. He didn't fly on a 206, weighs 1,600 kilos, and he hasn't flown the sling for 3 months or more. So I wasn't sure whether or not that actually he would be legal to go fly it. So I suggested to him that he goes and does 3, before he takes a passenger with him, which is what he wanted to do, just go and do 3 takeoffs and landings to get used to it again, and then take his passenger. Would you like to comment on that, please, for us?
I think at the end of the day, you've answered the questions yourself. In terms of legality, if he meets the group requirements for currency, then he's current. But is he current on type? Now, 3 months is a question. So we risk mitigated, okay? What's the conditions like today? What's he intending to do? Is he going to a foreign airfield? How's the risk stacking up against what he's not in terms of the non-currency? If he's going to fly the same airfield in good conditions on the same day without any passengers, and he flew there last week in a similar aircraft, then we could argue that there's no need. So I think this is where, as CFIs, we need to move away from the legality and what prescribed requirements are, and let's look at assessing, having pilots become self-assessing. And we've had Katie give a very good presentation, and we're going to continue this thread of discussion about risk management. Now, pilots, we teach the skills through the syllabus of flying, but this next layer, there's 2 layers, if you like, of risk management assessment, and then the overriding human factors that sit behind those decisions of risk management. So to answer your question, I would have said to the pilot, are you comfortable, and are you going to be doing anything different which would raise your risk level because you haven't flown this aircraft for 3 months or whatever. And recency and currency are an interchangeable discussion about the pilot's performance on the day. And at the end of the day, I would say that it would be advisable for that pilot to go out and do exactly what you did, and that's go out and just crack out a circuit or 2. And if there's been any changes in the aircraft in terms of like an EFIS programming or a setup where some of these newer types we have changes, or you've only had the aircraft online and identified an anomaly in the fuel readings or something like that, they're the opportunities for a school as a hiring organisation or as a CFI or an instructor to highlight the pilot's awareness of moving from type to type. And the other thing, of course, is privacy. If he's used to doing one thing in a particular aircraft, and you know that this aircraft has got a system that's almost contrary to that, and the Beech Piper, Cessna Piper Beech scenario, it was a classic one from the 70s and 80s, this is where we're starting to get fuel mismanagement issues. Somebody's primacy tells them that I turn around and I turn the tap this way, or I reach down and I turn the tap this way, and now I'm in an aeroplane that I just haven't flown for 3 months, and my motor primacy says turn it that way. next thing we have an engine failure. So they're the sort of elements that of non-recency on type get raised, and it's about risk assessment at the end of the day. Jill, do you have any comments on that? Anybody? Sorry, Colin.
Hi Neil, yeah. Just to add to that, you've almost answered the question I was going to put in there. But I mean, we're operating in a Class D environment. We've got 4 different types of aircraft. It's not a question of whether it's legal or is a person legal to fly a plane. It's a question of what's our risk level and how are we going to assess that person. They might fly one day and be perfectly good. A week later, different situation, they're not quite so safe. Recency is the key thing. We've put a 30-day currency on all the aircraft. So regardless of type, class or whatever, if that person hasn't flown in that aircraft in 30 days, they've got to do a check flight. That might be excessive for some places, but in the environment we're operating in, I think that's a sensible risk scenario.
Thanks, Colin. And you know, I'd hope to think that as a group of our senior instructors and CFIs, that it's that level of thinking that we're applying to those decision processes, rather than the regulatory process. Because at the end of the day, we can just put more regulation in, but none of us wants that. And really, we know it won't be effective. So what we need to do is work towards self-management and risk assessment, and be the champions and the mentors for that process. So thanks very much for that. And yeah, the sling's going well. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was the removal of type training in relation to high performance, low performance. Clearly, if we go back and look at history for the removal, everyone was clear and was explained last year about why we did it. Is anybody seeing any issues in this delineation and movement more towards type along the lines we were discussing? No problems? Trevor? Leanne's away.
Trevor Bange from Clifton. I've seen a number of students coming along, or not students but pilot owners, who can't interpret or understand their interpretation of, is it low performance, is it high performance, and then I've got a X-Air or I've got a thruster, will a drifter endorsement count for that? And their interpretations of what it is, do I have to actually go and do my training in the X-Air when they can't get an access to that aircraft, is becoming a problem, and it's the students out there who are having difficulties trying to interpret that.
Look, I agree, and when we've had such a delineation for many years, of course the reference is going to be, well, where do I sit on that side of delineation? So you're right, a drifter and an X-Air would, for all intents and purposes, be both low performance aircraft. Again, an X-Air and the systems, an X-Air and a drifter have got a number of different systems and a number of different things that will catch you out, even if in terms of glide profile and approach profile, they're very different aircraft. So this is why we introduced type training, was so that if somebody was had flown only an X-Air and was going to fly a drifter, it's incumbent upon the pilot to go and get the appropriate time on that particular aircraft with an experienced instructor or pilot, and actually be able to identify the different areas. So that's why we removed it, because the delineation, and it was originally the Savannah versus, the Savannah was one of the aircraft and the Foxbat was stuck in the middle, like cruising along at 80 or 90 knots, and yet they can be flown down as slow as 40 knots or 35 knots if you want to get a bit brave. So, where do they sit? And they behave different they behave more like a low performance aircraft in the landing phase, but operate in the normal environment like a normal high performance aircraft. So, the answer to the question, I guess, is that, again, he's flying the same performance aircraft, but he needs to be familiar with the differences between the two types. All right, well, no other questions about that part?
Yeah, Neil, the high performance and low performance, when it was in, well, it wasn't in category B, and that, which I felt was a bit of a shame, because I've got aircraft that sit on 100 knots, and we've got aircraft that sit on 45 knots. And the type training was essential in that area. So I think it was good to remove it and just have the type training on that. I tend to take the students through the range of aircraft, so they're not stuck with a specific type, whether it be a two-stroke of their own or whether they fly the Quick R, which is 100-knot machine. And that, so yeah, it sort of works out much better that way. But I think dropping the high performance, low performance is a good idea.
And trikes, and we're seeing even now powered parachutes are becoming the areas where we're seeing massive change in development. There's been an enormous change. And I mean, it first happened in Britain, and we've seen the copies and the derivatives come into trikes now. We've got very high performance wings, and the wings are starting to behave more like a high performance three-axis or a three-axis wing. We're starting to see stall spin and over banked aircraft developing, departure characteristics that we would never have seen in something like a wizard wing or something along those lines. Now, this is clearly not relevant to a lot of our three-axis instructors that only teach in an average range aircraft, but we have to look at the diversity of an organisation and also recognise when we're taking people from different groups, from Group B to Group A, and likewise from Group A to Group B, that there are going to be these differences that we need to get them to understand. So I guess the question, sticking to the topic on the students and syllabus, is does the syllabus address these differences, and as you as CFIs who are responsible for delivering the training, aware of how to deliver those differences within the syllabus? But I guess we don't know what we don't know. Now, the next question I wanted to cover was, and it comes up a lot these days, one of the things we've talked earlier about human factors, and it's an overused buzzword. It's been overused since its introduction, and we keep seeing human factor related incidents, and we keep probably wondering, how does that happen? How does somebody make those mistakes? If we look historically, RAI's introduced human factors simply as a compliance requirement, virtually thrown upon us by CASA. It was something that we had to do, and therefore we introduced a process that went over 2 years where all pilots had to adapt to it. So again, we go back to a regulatory requirement. Did it have the desired effect? Everybody had to go and do a HF exam. They sat down with a book begrudgingly, and they got HF written on their ticket. Did we really address human factors? I think we failed dismally in that respect. We met the compliance requirements, but we were reactive. We were acting on behalf of a regulatory requirement, and we did it. Now, I'm not saying that people didn't learn things as a result of it, but one could argue that the further we get away from that moment in time where we actually made it a requirement, where it was a conversation on the table, we've actually seen a degradation in awareness of human factors and also its contribution to accidents. And we keep having the same arguments. As my learned friends say, pilots don't find new ways of killing themselves. So, how do we get human factors in a real sense back onto the table? Now, I've been doing a lot of work in the human factors elements and integration into the training from an instructor manual point of view, as well as from the syllabus point of view. And clearly, integrating human factors into every single element of our training syllabus is the only way we are going to get primacy of understanding and relevance to human factors. So from the day we start training, are we opening up the human factors discussion in everything we teach? And if you are, can you give us examples for the group of how you do it? Peter, again? Peter, you don't have, you won't run out of mics. So anybody else? I want to hear something. But yes, by all means.
Well, we start with the human factors on the first day that the student arrives. So what do? We go through weather. Before they even enter the aircraft, they need to know the weather of the day. They look at the big picture, smaller picture, micro weather. Then we look at the NOTAMs, because we can't fly the aircraft without the NOTAMs, and we haven't even ventured towards the aircraft yet. Now at this point, we then walk out, we do our, are you fit to fly? Is the aircraft fit to fly? Then we conduct our briefing and we do our flight. So we've started human factors right at the beginning. We're looking at the weather element.
A show of hands of who starts HF and actually breaks it down into what specific elements we're talking about. Who does that from day one? So I think we've got a consensus that we're all working to that goal right from day one. Good. Thanks, Peter. Paul, you had sorry, Trevor. But Paul, seeing you there.
Yeah, look, that was a great comment, and just to follow on from that one, a great opportunity to introduce human factors training is in what in GA land they call the short brief, or the pre-flight operational briefing. I'm not sure how many of us actually do those in practice. Can I just have a show of hands who does a short pre-flight brief or operational brief? Yeah, great. So that's an excellent opportunity to put the human factor stuff in there. I assisted on an instructor course recently in the Sunny Coast with Doug and Colin there. Their operation had a very good culture of doing a short brief. And look, it's one of those things that you know, we've got it in our manual. We try and do it as well, but when you've got a busy day, you end up doing the big brief and it's straight out to the aeroplane. But if you can just take a couple of minutes, if you've done a long brief just before you get in the aeroplane, after you've perhaps had a bit of a break, or if you're not doing a long brief, then ideally at least do a short operational brief covering those sorts of things: weather conditions, NOTAMs, serviceability of the aeroplane, fit to fly, all that sort of stuff. Great time to do it.
Good, thanks Paul. Trevor?
No, to be covered.
Oh, good, okay. Well, look, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad to hear that there's already an agreed participation. We are not going to get pilots to actually embrace human factors and the real meaning of human factors that applies to their decision making and all the elements, from threat and error management to decision making to situational awareness and so on, unless we start from the beginning. It's got to be as ingrained as what an elevator does and what airspeed, how important airspeed is. And if it's not in that same marriage of thoughts from the start, then we will not get even the awareness of what they don't know. So thanks very much. Miles?
Yeah, Miles here, Neil. We're talking about human factors training with our students. Human factors doesn't stop once they have got their pilot certificate and they're out flying. Anybody that comes to hire the aircraft at my place, we're doing human factors all the time, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's looking after your mate's back, and that's what we're here for. So I urge everybody just to continue on that sort of stuff, whether they're a pilot or a student. Yes, we've got to do the student human factors training there, but let's keep it going all the way through.
Thanks, Miles. Yeah. Look, tomorrow you'll see some generic briefing sets that we've developed, and who uses when they're in their briefs, whether it's short brief or long brief, a little airmanship box somewhere in their briefing. It'll live somewhere on the briefing, whether it's a whiteboard or whatever. Yep, a reasonable amount. Okay, we're going to increase what we're trying to expose that concept to or open it up to is more about airmanship and human factors. What are the things that are going to affect me on this flight that I need to be aware of as an operator, and of all the things that I have to consider? So it's this lost term of airmanship. If anyone read the article that was written about the lost art of airmanship last year, it was trying to break down this discussion as to how we relate human factors in airmanship, because we always hear about it, and in one of our complaint processes is, oh, that was really bad airmanship, this pilot didn't show good airmanship. This indefinable, well, what did he do wrong? How can we break it down? Well, if we haven't taught them about taxi speeds or about looking out or slowing down when you're in behind hangars as part of a good risk assessment and the situational awareness, then how can we possibly, we're only dealing with it, as we said before, as a lagging indicator and reactively in our training systems and also in our safety systems. So thanks. Next thing I want to talk about is technology in the cockpit. And this actually ties into human factors, but it's also tied into the syllabus. At the moment, the syllabus doesn't really address the use of the technological advances that have become prevalent in a lot of our aircraft today. And I wanted to open it up and have some discussion about should we increase and have some training syllabus elements for technology, the different types of technology, and how we use them, and how we adapt to their understanding in the cockpit. Douglas, would you like to expand on your yes?
All you've got to do is take a student and try and do a G1000 conversion on a Cirrus or something. You'll see the problem straight away, or even some of the Dynon systems we've seen in RA, and every single one is different. And we get students tied up in all sorts of problems with mode shift, and it's a real problem, and the answer is yes, most definitely.
Who's got an EFIS-equipped aircraft in their fleet of training aircraft? Sorry?
It's bloody useless.
It's bloody useless. Where do you find when your student gets in there for the first time, even if he's a competent pilot, where is he looking?
He's looking at the screen, but I tell him, look outside, look outside.
Yeah. So this straight visualisation of chasing digitalised information and trying to assimilate digitalised information into decision making is one of the key aspects of threat and error management that need to be taught in terms of electronic systems. The other thing is redundancy, and the other thing is dependence. So we talk about Oz runways, it's whether we like it or not, technology exists in aviation, and it probably exists at a higher level and an unmanaged level in recreational aviation than it does in other areas. It's used for flight bags and it's very much prescribed in commercial operations and how it's used. But in recreational operations, we see the prolific use of it. Now, of course, we've all talked about the dumbing down of the fundamental understanding of principles, and navigation's a classic example, but it's much deeper than that. So, do we need to incorporate a much more expanded understanding of what should be taught in terms of electronics in the cockpit? Show of hands? Yes? No?
I think we need, but the problem is that those technology changes. Richard Tobacco, by the way, Michael is. Those technologies changes so rapidly that whatever you put in syllabus will be outdated by the time you publish it. So I definitely would support the idea that students should be trained on those things, in particular in aspect of dependency and reliability on them. So like, for instance, the student should fly and look when he's flying, not looking at the iPad all the time. But yeah, that should be incorporated, but in very clever way, so we are not getting to that trap of being outdated every time.
Thanks, Richard. Look, I totally agree. The idea with a syllabus of specific reference elements would not be to address specific systems. It would be to address processes of learning, processes of scanning, and processes of decision-making where you get conflict of information. And I think one of the areas, so these are very much human factor related issues, but they're also about systemic processing issues. How do we teach our pilots, and I'm using big words, but how do we teach our pilots to integrate and use the good parts of electronic information without letting it distract them from the real art of flying the plane?
Trevor Bange again. One of the issues I have with introducing it into the syllabus is, as indicated here a few minutes ago, most of the schools don't have this equipment. So how are we going to force it on people as a syllabus item if we don't have the aircraft and the fleets and the people out there who can teach it?
Don't have the aircraft, don't need to teach it. They go and fly an
But if it's
aircraft
in the
that
syllabus,
does.
how are you going to handle it in the syllabus if you mark it in the syllabus? It's going to be then a requirement.
That goes into type training. So if they fly a type where they haven't been used to using the EFIS system, and that's one of the elements that we do cover in type training, has it got different fuel delivery systems, different EFIS systems, different control systems, and some of those key guidelines that we're using in the type training, I hope you've all seen. Who has seen the list of guidelines describing what determines different types? Doug, Colin, 2 people in the room. So when I asked the question about how's type training been effective, and I asked around the room who's actually seen some of the list of things that we need to look at in type training, the rooms. So clearly there's an area we need to get information out. So we actually placed that information on the website, and it was sent out to CFIs too, I believe. So we need to, obviously there's a communication issue, we need to get that information out, because EFIS systems, to answer your question, is one of the areas that's covered in terms of type differences. And clearly when you get into a J170 or something with 2 dynoms, Skyview 10 inches in it, you need to, yeah. So look, we'll make an action point to follow that up and get that training information out to CFIs, and we'd expect you to pass that through your instructional staff as well as a guideline. Okay, thanks for that.
Neil, sorry, just before you close on that subject, I think you probably need something a bit more specific. You'd need some specific elements in the syllabus.
Yes.
But there's an easy way to get around the complexity and the issues that Trevor raises, and that's just make it optional. Put a little asterisk, make it optional. The CASA MOS is full of optional units, so it's not fitted, not required.
Yes. Is that are you happy with that, Trevor? Yeah. Yeah, look, obviously, we talk about teaching the type, but if you don't have the type of aircraft, you can't teach what's involved. Sorry.
Before you go, can I get to a bit on that?
Yes, sir. So,
look, we started training with this type of equipment in 1982, and Boeing came along, they gave us a 2-day upgrade and said, this is how it all works. And we said, well, how do we use it? And they said, we don't really know, but we'll come back in a year's time, we'll ask you what works. And this is serious, And then we didn't get the aeroplane for 3 months. And I walk out with a flight plane and think, holy shit, that's one of the new ones. And we'd be flying along, we'd say, what's it doing now? Now, up till this year, I'm still involved in this stuff, and you all saw that crash of AirAsia in San Francisco, and they were looking at the glass, and they had no idea what it was doing. And their accident was purely pilot incompetence because they didn't know what they'd done, and they couldn't interpret what was going on. And we put programs in the last couple of years since Air France lost that aeroplane over the Atlantic. And we found that when we started putting the right combination in where the data would lie to you with data corruption, 3 out of 4 pilots crashed, and these were the good guys in the good airlines. So in the end, we're going back to where you guys are now, and what we now try and teach them is you must know your power and your attitude for each phase of your flight. And you must refer to that and forget everything else if you start to get doubts. So don't get too complex. If anything, try and keep it really simple and just show them the basic data, but say, remember this is secondary. Primary is your attitude and your power, and that's it. Because it really can get away from you.
Thanks very much. Look, it's scary when we see some of these big high-level training accidents or real accidents that occur because of system distractions in the cockpit.
Yeah, Michael, thanks for that advice. That follows on from what I want to say. It's really important when we do the training, remember we're trying to give basic training to keep them safe. We're not trying to do it in 160 hours. We're actually trying to do it in 40 hours or less. And so it's really important for us as instructors in teaching some of this other stuff that's in the cockpit, don't get their head in it so that they think that's primary, unless they're prepared to spend the extra hour. So when you speak about competency and then growth and then mature, that can be in their growth phase. But I agree 100%, Michael. We've all got EFISs in. Quite often there's 2 airspeeds. Teach them on one, show them the other, but don't go into it. Otherwise what you'll end up doing is teaching them what you're interested in flying, not what they need to have the basic toolkit to survive every emergency.
And a man with 2 watches never knows what time it is.
And the thing is, this younger generation, they believe all that stuff. They think it's going to work every time.
Yeah, of course.
And the fact of the matter, we train them all. I say, don't believe it. It will lie to you on occasions. But it's really hard to get them to go back looking at basics. And I'm talking really good, well-trained kids. And they screw up real bad at times.
One of the things that's concerning is operations. We hear of reports of pilots flying in a marginal VMC and using the synthetic generated artificial horizon on a Dynon or something like that to give themselves some situational awareness. Now, we all know how fraught with danger that whole issue is, but the technology is providing a non-foolproof but believable horizon. And we've had incidences where we've heard anecdotally of pilots using them. And this is the thing, we can't stop the technology. The technology is going to keep coming into the cockpit. We've just got to make sure we mitigate how it's used with understanding the risks. And as Ken says, keep it simple, teach them on primaries, and make sure, as you say eloquently, Michael, come back to the basics of always relying on the primacy of the basic instrument, or the basic horizon, which is... Michael.
I agree with Ken and the last speaker as well. The average age of my students is 59. Kids can tell me the square root of a pickle. They can't take the lid off the bloody jar. My 59-year-old students have forgotten what the square root of a pickle is. They can certainly take the lid off the jar, but they can't find the jar. So what I'm actually saying to you all is that I have to keep all my training very, very, very simple. They don't want the whiz, big bang things that kids use and get into trouble with. They want steam-driven instruments which make everything as simple, because quite frankly they come back the next week and they forgot what the hell I told them last week. And the other problem I have, and it's quite a serious one, is I'm older than they are, but I do 300 hours a year. They are lucky when they've qualified to do more than 15 to 20. So currency is a problem. And what I'm actually saying is I keep everything basic. And all I want them to do is to fly safely, carefully, and regularly.
Thank you very much. I think there's a general agreement with everything you just said there, Mike. Kelvin.
Kelvin from Warwick. Just on the
issue of us getting new endorsements and things in the future and looking at the syllabus and things like that, I mean, should we be considering in 95, 55 aircraft having an artificial horizon, not electronic, but actually, and doing some under the hood? I mean, is that a consideration from safety? I mean, I think everybody would admit at some stage that they've got themselves into a situation where it would have been useful, but you know, when you buy a standard aircraft these days, in most situations you don't have an artificial horizon in the cockpit. And is it something, considering that we're going to be looking at endorsements into controlled airspace and that, is that something we should not be considering in the near future?
Look, it's a pit we can dive into, and I'm happy to dive into it. We've got probably another 20 minutes, and I've got a bit more to get through. It's a real big question. There's two schools of thoughts on this whole subject. Do we teach somebody for avoidance, and we build a culture of risk management to keep them away from these sharp edges of the air? Or do we embrace them with tools that if they get themselves into trouble, that they've got a basic set of skills? I think Mike just hit on an important point, and its relevance is completely important to the issue of AHs and instrument, even basic instrument flying, is currency. If we teach somebody in their primary training syllabus how to basically do a rate one turn and how to manage the AH and the calibration and why we deviate and don't do this, and the scan cycle and the referencing matrix that we use for instrument for IF flight, how relevant is that going to be if the guy has never even done it in the last 6 to 12 months when he gets himself into a high-risk situation? And I'll probably hand over to Douglas one at a time if you like. Yeah.
I'll get to get in first. I've got the mic. I've got the mic. Sorry.
Sorry.
Douglas, soon coming up.
This is great, guys.
Sorry, Neil, we've had this discussion ourselves about recency and the type, the depth of the training and so on. You hit on a key point here with the artificial horizon. I mean, how many guys here are flying aircraft with artificial horizon? How many of those artificial horizons are made in China? How many are reliable? What are we teaching? Are we teaching somebody to use the skills of an artificial horizon, or are we encouraging them to go into IMC conditions? I mean, as Trevor said, we're teaching basic flying skills here. I cover up the EFIS. I cover up anything that's not to do with that, attitude reference points and so on. Yes, there is an argument. If you've got a G1000 or you've got something that is built for the job, put a course together on it. Teach it. Great. But for basic flying skills, I don't think the quality of the equipment that's in the most RAA planes is up to the job.
Thanks, and we talked about the fatality statistics, and we'll talk more about it later on, but flight into IMC continues to be one of the killers, and it's been killing pilots for a long time. So the last thing I believe we want to do is give somebody a tool, a half-baked tool with a half-baked degree of knowledge that might encourage them. I know the arguments that went through the 70s and the 60s in terms of the basic two-hour instrument training. There's been a change in that under Part 61 as well, but I'll let Douglas speak now because he bats on both sides of the fence and he's fairly involved in these areas. Douglas.
It's a human factors problem. It's not a flight training problem. The guts of it is human factors. We need to give them all the tools to save themselves should they get into that situation. Have a look at the requirements for RPL, 2 hours of IF. Now, none of us in this room can teach anybody to fly an instruments in 2 hours. What we can do is teach them to do a 180-degree level turn and do a letdown over the ocean. That's the best we can do. But it's a human factors problem, it's not a flying skills problem.
Yeah, so I think, and I agree, thanks very much, and I think what we're better spending our attention on in relation to instrument flying is working more at the other end of the equation, which is the human factors end. And I think we'll get much better results. Thanks very much. Look, we'll just spend a short amount of time. I know we've only got a few Group B instructors here. Our accident statistics and investigations show that movement to unusual attitudes in some of the higher performance wings is a more prevalent aspect in the changing dynamic of our Group B and soon to become more prevalent in our Group D operations as well. Who teaches unusual attitudes as part of the training syllabus? James? you were just in an unusual attitude. It's probably a usual attitude this time in the afternoon. So look, do we all teach an unusual attitudes as part of our training, as part of the training syllabus? Yes? Okay. We don't necessarily want to put the aircraft into a part of the envelope we don't want to be, but again, and it almost correlates back to what Douglas was saying, we certainly need to teach our pilots how to move away from them. Our Group B aircraft have changed significantly in the last 5 to 7 years. We're starting to see them behave very differently to the old Regallo platforms that have developed over quite a number of years, and are now behaving very differently at the high performance end. Would that be a general? People agree that fly high performance or a range of different trucks. Would that be a general agreement amongst our Group B? How can we better integrate and teach the dilemmas that our pilots are getting themselves into? And I don't just mean this for Group B. This also applies to elliptical wing, high performance airflow 3-axis types as well. But where and how do we use within the syllabus our ability to teach those things in terms of this is where it's going to bite you, this is how it bites. Who saw the Spitfire accident that was at Watts Bridge? It was all over YouTube. Okay, what was the key problem? What was the key generating problem in that accident? Anybody want to boldly suggest? Sorry, Doug, I'll keep you out of this.
He didn't get the tail up and had an appropriate angle of attack to actually get flying. He kept the tail on and tried to pull it off the ground. Sorry. The aeroplane was kept tail low for the run down the runway, and it was already at critical angle of attack, and it just lifted off, and it was rolling the instant it left the runway. And at no stage did it actually really start flying. So, if he'd gotten the tail up, reduced his angle of attack, got a bit more speed and lifted off a bit later down the runway, he would have been fine.
There you go, Patricia. We've got another ATSB investigator right on the ball. So, look, a fair assessment. Other people might have different views in the room. I wasn't there. I've seen the footage, and I think most people have got a view and an opinion on it. There was an aircraft that was in a similar performance group to different aircraft, different to the performance group of that pilot, who was able to fly in a three-point configuration right through the takeoff phase, and had done possibly thousands of hours doing that, but had very limited time on that type of aircraft, and through primacy was trying to fly the aircraft in exactly the same way in his existing tail dragger. So you're absolutely right. Stalled wingtip was all gone as soon as even before the aircraft separated from the ground. What was a unique design characteristic that made that situation worse for that pilot? Anybody? John? So torque effect was a major...
Yeah, torque effect.
Yep.
And as a result of that, carrying opposite rudder and holding the stick into the wind or opposite to the rudder, and set up that situation that was inevitable.
And what about lift distribution on elliptical winged aircraft? The reason I'm raising this is because this becomes more prevalent when we start talking about high performance strikes. Because what we've got, the thing that saved high performance strikes over the years in terms of its pitch stability or dive recovery, which also hindered performance, was the reflex. So we're now starting to see wings with very low reflex and high speeds, and deformation of the wing is occurring because we're actually, I know with the bionics and so on, they're putting porting in to try and get stabilisation of air pressure in between the two surfaces. Is that right, Peter? Is that right? We're seeing changes in the way that the wings are designed because of their performance characteristics. Well, the Spitfire design's been around for a long time.
Yeah. Generally with the topless wings, you've got what they call sprogs in the wings. Now, the British have brought out stars, which is now a situation which actually puts billow shift into the wing, which now makes it... I've been flying the Quick R for a few hours now, and I put it into many unusual attitudes, and it doesn't slip away like a lot of the others do, where the Arrow and the SST wing tend to slide a bit. You have to be careful with them. But where you say needs increased focus on unusual attitude, it comes back to your type endorsement. And this is what I brought up many years ago when the strutted wings came in. It's a type endorsement. People are flying them too slow, and they're trying to do the manoeuvres that they're used to doing in their slower wings with a high performance wing. It just doesn't work. Low to the ground, turning base, they slide in. and we've seen, unfortunately, too many deaths because of that. Had that student or had that pilot been trained on that type of wing, we wouldn't be seeing those incidents now. And I really think it's all type endorsement. It's not unusual. It's just a type endorsement. They buy the aircraft, they buy the wing. I've mentioned to Airborne numerous times. Give them training. No, it falls on deaf ears. No, don't need it. But I find with all the different types I've flown many different types now. And when I get a new aircraft, it's generally 15 to 20 hours before I put a student in the front seat. I want to know what it's going to do before I have to teach the student that.
Yeah, good.
So it's a type endorsement thing. I don't believe it's something that is just a common thing. You buy a new wing for your aircraft, or you buy a new aircraft, you should have some form of type endorsement on that particular wing from someone who knows how they fly, not someone who just, I've got a wing.
I love it when my slides are following the conversation that's happening. Thanks very much, Peter. We've got a few hands around the room. Ken, we might grab you in the interest of the walking back.
Yeah, I think putting those two together, you were speaking about unusual attitudes and then you went through the Watts Bridge one. I think whilst unusual attitudes are important, it's much more important to have a good primary focus on what the usual attitudes are. And I think one of the good ways to teach a usual attitude for takeoff, which must be very ingrained for every aircraft type you do, is teach low power takeoffs. So that once they get that takeoff attitude for that aircraft, and then you say to them, I'm now going to do it at low power, it really teaches them. That's the takeoff attitude for that aircraft, and if they have that attitude and it's not taken off, don't try and increase the attitude to take off, because we get this time thing. People get in their head that, well, I apply the power and at about this time it does this and about this time it does that, or it's not doing it, I'll pull it back further. So usual attitudes are very important to teach.
Thanks. Look, you actually just unravelled I was hoping that somebody would say that, because the reason I provoked the discussion about unusual attitude, we're talking about an unusual takeoff attitude for an aircraft that's performance characteristics, will not let it get away with it, and thereby come back to a usual attitude. What is the correct attitude? And we all know, basically, tail draggers, I know tail draggers are less prolific in training these days than what they ever were, but we get the aircraft into a flying configuration, we get it to 4 degrees, we get that wing where it wants to be, the correct takeoff attitude, and we fly the aeroplane from that point. We don't try and haul it into the ground, we don't keep it on the ground and try and do some massive pull-up because it looks good to our mates. We teach the normal configuration. So thanks very much. And Dave, yes?
Yeah, Dave Griffith from Boona. Reference to Spitfire at Watts Bridge a few weeks ago. If you have a close look at the video, he's actually got an asymmetric flap condition on takeoff.
No, he didn't. It's the picture, it looks like that, but what it was an aberration because of the complete aileron deflection from one side to the other. There was no asymmetric flap.
Oh, okay.
There was no asymmetric flap in that aircraft. I spoke to the guy who flew it only last weekend. No. And look, that was a common thing. People saw that picture and thought that was a picture. And look, a very humbling experience for the pilot, very experienced pilot. But again, it just shows none of us are infallible. We can all make these mistakes.
Yeah, on more than Neil, talked about unusual attitudes. I mean, obviously from my side, I've been an aerobatic pilot, that's close to my heart. But what we're talking about really is a competency. And Part 61 has now got this general competency rule, which is really what you're talking about. Everyone needs to be competent in the particular type of aeroplane they're flying, and it's on the pilot to make sure they've got their competency and seek out the right training to get it. Starting to introduce something like this into the syllabus would make it very clumsy and awkward, I think. So it's really down to a general competency rule like Part 61 has introduced, which I think is a good move.
No, thanks. And the last one I wanted to cover from a Group B point of view at least was micro-meteorology and also rigging and de-rigging. Some unique things that we have for some of our aircraft, and it's less prevalent these days, particularly in 3-axis, is we don't take the aircraft in a trailer and assemble it and fly it. We basically turn up, pull the thing out of a hangar or untie it and we go and fly it. But that's not true for our microlights. a lot of our microlights are packed up, and even if they're not done, if that doesn't happen during training, they will often get out and they'll have to rig and de-rig that. Now, rigging and de-rigging is not really part of our training, and we don't cover it in the syllabus. And I think would there be a general agreement that we should include elements of that in the syllabus for at least Group B and possibly and most likely Group D in terms of unpacking the wing. Richard?
Yeah, there's, if you're talking about Group B, there are quite a few other elements that should be actually, talking about Group B, there are quite a few other elements that should be specifically developed in syllabus for Type B aircraft, which are related to stalling, which are related to even straight and level flying, which is quite different than in 3-axis. In turning, effect of pusher at the back and the way that tracks are made, turning in right to the right is different than to the left. And so a number of things I believe should be developed in the syllabus slightly different, plus or whatever you put on a slideshow at the moment earlier.
Thanks, Richard. Look, and if you've got these elements, please feed them back to me. At the moment, we're doing a syllabus redesign, and any of these elements I want to make sure I include, but I don't want to do it on the basis of the small amount of information I've got. I want it to come from our experts out in the field. So please pass that back to me. You've all got my email address, so pass that on. Thanks very much. And the last element I wanted to cover was basically micrometeorology. Our lighter weight aircraft, are much more affected by smaller changes in local effects in terms of mechanical turbulence and so on. We don't tend to cover meteorology. Well, who covers meteorology in any scope during the pilot certificate course? I mean, I imagine we all would. Do we go down into to mountains and rotor and lee side and cover all those elements? Good. It's explored more as part of the Nav and Med exam, as we know, and as part of the navigation syllabus, but do we include it more for our Group B and Group D cousins? Because clearly there's going to be they work in much tighter parameters in general flight, but do we include those things as more specific mentions, or just include micrometeorology earlier in the syllabus for those specific groups?
They should be included anyway as part of your pilot training. And it wouldn't matter whether it's type A, B or D.
No, look, I agree. You can get yourself caught out just in a 10-knot crosswind in any aircraft in the wrong conditions.
Yeah, I mean, we take students away from Yarrawonga all the time to many different airfields. We've got gliders, contra circuits, all that sort of stuff, long before they've got their pilot certificate. And so they do flight into terrain. That's important. If they don't know the basics, they'll get themselves into trouble, regardless of whether they just got their pilot certificate and flying around. They could still get themselves into very bad trouble.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Guys, I don't want to spend too much more time on that right now. I won't cover any powered parachute stuff unless anyone specifically wants me to cover it. No? Yes? Yes, Jill? Oh, okay.
We've done one level again. I just wanted to quickly chat to you guys. Neil's done a wonderful job here just talking about the various elements with the different types of aircraft. We have got, obviously, a number of powered parachute pilots in our organisation, and one of the key problems we have is lack of CFIs and instructors. So I know you guys are probably down the path of 3-axis or weight shift, whatever you're doing in Group B. If you do consider a possibility of a powered parachute aircraft and adding that to your school, there's some assistance that Ops can give to make that a reasonably painless transition. We're also doing quite a lot of amendments to the powered parachute requirements in the Ops manual because it is such a simple aircraft to fly. And I have been asked by one of the importers to let them know, to let the CFIs know if they are interested, that one of the importers is offering powered parachutes at a reduced price to purchasers from CFIs to get more people operating in that regime. So So it's not necessarily an area you've thought about, but it is possibly another adjunct to your flying training that you're doing now to expand your operations. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks. Cool. Yeah, look, it's a huge growth area. I also spent a bit of time on the HGFA side of the fence, and paramotors or PPG and HGFA are a huge growth area for manned flight, self-manned flight. So we're starting to see this rebirth of a new, very much basic, cheap form of aviation. As I don't know, you've only got to look around, guys. The average price of a recreational aircraft new these days is about 120 grand. It ain't getting any cheaper to learn, you know. So we are starting to see the market tell us that there's still the guy that's got the stars in his eyes that wants to fly. If he's got to do it in a parachute or even in a $25,000 trike, he'll use that rather because he knows that it's a much easier way to get in the air. So I know it doesn't have pertinence to most people in the room here, but we need to be aware that these things are there, and there's opportunities in terms of our schools being able to, particularly our Group B schools, to say, look, you know, parachutes really aren't my thing, but you know what, it's a lot of fun, it's pretty simple. Once I've got a bit of canopy experience, I can be teaching that and offering it as another adjunct to the way I operate. And I don't know about you guys, but experience is a very important thing from an instructor's point of view and also from a pilot's point of view. It's not just about vertical experience. You need to have vertical and wide experience. So if you can jump in a different type, even as an instructor, go and do it. If you haven't flown a gyro, if you haven't flown a trike, or just go and spend a bit of time. You're going to see them in the circuit somewhere when you're flying, so you might as well have a bit of an understanding. Go and jump in a glider if you want to go over to our GFA cousins and go and do some real glide circuits for a while. So I can only encourage you in terms of developing your expanded thinking about the elements that we have in our hours, that you actually give yourself the chance to understand it, because it might actually refresh your own thinking about flying and just repin some of those basics. We won't cover any more about them. Just one last bit we're going to talk about, theory. It's a good slide. I was down doing a flight school assessment. In fact, James will know where this one's from. He saw me take the photo. But I thought that was a pretty good picture on the side of the wall. Talking about keeping it simple. It's true. And I just want to talk about what we do with our theory. Again, I get the opportunity to assess candidates and pilots and even instructors, and I'm quite surprised sometimes at both ends. And I think Colin and Doug mentioned about the short brief. Well, I remember when I first was involved with that school and helping them get set up, they'd been very much trained out of regimented GA style brief that was very long and involved, and I had to get my physics hat back on and start to think about it. They've come up with a very workable system now that actually works really well. But what do we do? What do we teach? Do we actually spend time with the students, or do we say, get your Dyson Holland or your Bob Tate and go away and learn this stuff? How much detail do you guys put into your briefings? And more importantly, what do you make sure is cemented in terms of their understanding, in terms of the theory behind the flight? So this is looking at the other side of the equation now, not just about types and flight and syllabus. Are we teaching? So a show of hands, who just does short briefs? Who grabs a stick in the ground and draws a chalk line and says that's a wing and this is how it flies? Any old glider pilot instructors here? Ken? Ian? Do we all do long briefs and short briefs? Okay. Do we do them all at the same time so that they're in the classroom for an hour and 10, an hour and 20 minutes and then we go and jump in a plane? No. I heard somebody talk about human factors. There's the first lesson. How much concentration do you think you're going to get out of a pilot when you've just stuffed an hour and a half's worth of theory into his head? None at all, are we? We are seeing deficiencies in the pilot product that we're putting out. We're seeing pilots and potential pilots that don't understand the difference between a spin and a spiral dive. They don't understand the real effect, further effect of rudder or rudder or so on. So do you run group theory? Who runs any group theory? Who gets a whole bunch of students and says, tonight guys, we're going to be talking about this or that? Yes? Okay. The good thing about group theory dynamics is that you actually get engagement with what we're doing now, and you'll actually get some cross-pollination. you get the elephants out of the room initially and people are prepared to talk, but they'll also learn, maybe not directly from you, but from their other pupils. I'd encourage you, if you've got the opportunity, to set aside that theory and move it away from the operational environment at times to actually do it. So we are looking to change the way we deliver some of our theory training and assist schools, and of course everybody wants to know about the new exam sets. We know most of the deficiencies. I've been asking all of you guys over the last 12 months, if you find a question, and we've got most of the ones, we know about the HF ones, know about the scaling and the maps in the NAV exam. The HF exam is being completely rewritten, and it's going to be very much focused on a different way of delivering scenario-based training with videos as well. But if there's anything that needs development in terms of our exam sets, I'd like to get some feedback. So that's the last subject I wanted to cover, just on theory and examinations. Do you think we're delivering enough theory? As a group of instructors in an organisation, are we teaching people the underpinning things they need to know? Put our hands on our hearts? Okay, good. All right, is there anything else that we could be doing? And maybe group specific? We talked about electronics for a start, but you know.
Weight shift specific questions.
Weight shift specific questions. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In BAK? Yeah, good. Thanks very much.
There is a BAK.
There is a weight shift BAK specific exam now.
Well, there's one with no free answers question, which isn't quite the same thing.
Okay.
Provide some suggested questions. We'll be happy to.
I went through this the last time the exams were changed and it got knocked back.
I went through this the last time the exams were changed, and the idea, I don't think any of the current RAL staff were employed at the time, so it's not you guys' fault. The compromise we reached was the paper BAK3's got no three-axis specific stuff in, but the suggestion I made then was there was like 5 questions at the end. You do either 5 three-axis or 5 weight shift or 5 powered parachute. So some alternate questions on at least one of the papers.
I take your point, John, and what we want to do is reopen that dialogue. Neil and I are both committed to addressing the fact that we've got very three-axis eccentric theory exams, etc. We want to have some focus groups for the Group B and Group D separate to this, and we'll open that dialogue back up again. Certainly do want to go down that path. So you put your money where your mouth is, so will we, and we'll get a commitment for that. That'll be good.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, John. Yes, Kelvin.
My hobby horse is biannual flight review.
Yes.
Has there been any thought around getting, obviously we've got guidelines from CASA that we use from the GA industry, etc., but has there been any thought around really trying to ramp up evaluation? Like obviously what we do now, you spend a lot of time on the theory, like on the whiteboard going through old techniques, because after 2 years most of them come in and they've forgotten quite a lot of the things that are going to keep them alive, I find, and then of course after that a focus on going and evaluating the flight. But with regard to having preparation, people walk in the door and they've done virtually no preparation at all, and you find that you've got to teach them a lot, or I find that I've got to teach them a lot. I mean, is there any way from a safety or human factors point of view that as an organisation that we could sort of get them doing something prior to coming, like there's a downloadable document or something that they have to evaluate that they're going to be quizzed on, or whatever it might happen to be? I don't suggest an exam, but at least have them, like I notice all my friends that go off, you know, doing GA evaluations every 2 years, like hit the books and SWOT up and do everything like that. And I very rarely find that the case. I'm just interested in if anybody else in the room feels that there needs to be more rigour around the biennial flight review.
We'll ask that question first. Who believes we need to have more guidance and more input in terms of the biannual flight review? Yes? All right. Who's seen and who's seen the biannual flight review checklist that I developed last year? Who uses it as a guideline for the sort of elements? Richard? Yeah. So it looks like not many people have seen that document. So I think the first thing, you're absolutely right, is to give you guys some guidance. That document's generic. You could give that to a pilot and say, you need to take this away and see if you're going to, because this is what I'm going to assess you on. So let's not make it some lucky dip of what's going to be assessed, because I do get that a lot, and Jill and I get this all the time. Oh, I'm going to get this guy, and of course what we get then is BFR shopping. Somebody's not competent, says, look, I'll go and see this guy, I won't go and see him, he'll be too hard. So, I'll go and see him, oh, have you had your BFR? Oh, I went to do it with him last week, but, he was busy. Yeah, right. Sorry, Ken. So yes, if you haven't seen the BFR checklist, we'll give Janelle, every CFI should have a copy of two things, the Converting Applicant checklist and the BFR checklist, because at least that's a guide framework. But I take the point on board, Kelvin, absolutely, we'll certainly commit to providing more guidance material. And if you remember when Part 61 came out, there was a whole raft of issues, Paul and all you 141 guys will know this, issues about having to be checked on every single competency of every approval, tail, no, instrument, they've done that right down to competency on the most recent type and all that sort of stuff. Is that right, Paul? I haven't got that wrong? Yeah. So, but having said that, yes, the whole general concept of the biennial flight review is to calibrate and check and confirm that the pilot at least has the minimum competency to the standard he was given a pilot certificate for. So we don't prescriptively say you must check this element. You don't have to go and do a 3.5 hour NAV with him, but if he hasn't done a NAV for 2 years and he's got a NAV endorsement, why wouldn't you at least make sure that he understood the concepts and could deliver it, even if it was only 20 minutes in a leg, in terms of departure procedures, checking, setting himself on course, doing his preliminary clear-off checks and so on. So look, we don't need to be prescriptive. Again, let's keep it simple. But by all means, let's make sure that we're assessing with that methodology, that he is at least competent to the competencies, to standard 2 of competency, in terms of being able to do it without assistance, without prompting, across any of the ratings or endorsements he might hold. So, good, Ken.
Yeah, Kelvin, I think it's an important point you raised. The biennial flight review is our chance to have less people dropping out the other end, because usually, when you look back, it was at a BFR decision where they decided to become non-compliant and non-legal from then on. So I think there's two things. We've developed a checklist. We use part of yours, but we also have some knowledge on how to get in and out of our circuit, because quite often BFR people are coming into your airfield for the first time. And I think the other thing that's important is that when they ring you, try and talk them through so they feel comfortable that they can treat it as a learning exercise. Don't, well, it's going to be this and that and the other. Don't scare the pants off them. Let them know that it is understandable they've got to be within a limit, but it's quite easy to get. And the people that I find, when they get that list and they read it through, they'll ring me back and they find it helpful. So it's a matter of being helpful so that you actually motivate them to think, oh, this is easy, I can come up to the standard, rather than feel like it might be too far.
Yeah, look, that's great, thanks, Ken. And it shouldn't be the elephant in the room. They should know what they should be assessed on. And they shouldn't be afraid of it, as you say. It's all about communication. So the communication has to start from our end, and as you can see, that's a much more engaged and mature process than what it was a few years ago. But it's so, if we give you the materials, and you've got your own materials, distribute it. Interesting point. And Jill and I think about the same thing. We come up with the same concepts. Wallace was discussing, when we do our fatality analysis and our serious accident analysis, guess what one of the key contributors that we identify? The pilot hasn't had a recent BFR. We often find it's that first stage of delineation and degradation away from compliance. The non-BFR pilot, it's not a time thing. Whether yesterday he missed his BFR, he's not going to have a crash tomorrow because he's one day out. But if this guy culturally or systemically has chosen not to have a BFR, or is BFR shocked and it's delayed, you better watch. This is the first line in the Swiss Gs. And it's one of many, but certainly if you haven't got your BFR currency, because you haven't had that exposure to independent assessment, and it's that decalibration that you're not getting from an external assessment that's dumbing you down to the risks that you're about to embark on. So the BFR is a very important process of continuance and compliance and keeping those minimum standards. And let's remember, it's a minimum standard. We'd like to see our pilots well and truly above, if not all, but most of the competencies that are in the syllabus when we do assess them. So we very much rely on your decision making, and if we can provide you better guidance material that's consistent, so that we don't get the demarcation and the shopping, then we will definitely be able to provide that for you. And the BFR checklist, please, if you haven't got it, just let Janelle know at the end of the session and she'll make a note and we will redistribute it. Who gets?
We'll redistribute it to all CFIs.
All CFIs. Look, if you get it again, it's an email. So that and the converting applicant checklist, because that's an area we find where there's deficiencies, where our old GAA pilots that are coming back to RA, we're not assessing them the correct way. So we've got those two documents and we'll get them back out to you. So thanks for that. So look, just to finish off, guys, it's been a long session. Reviewing what we teach is important as the way we teach. So we need to make sure we're teaching the right things and the right elements. So that's what this session's been about, talking about the syllabus, how it works, what doesn't work, what we can add. And future-proofing our pilots. By doing it well at the start, we're giving our pilots a better chance to be successful in terms of our generics and the skill sets that we've built in their foundations. And the important thing from a learning point of view is the world is a whole new world of forms of stimulus. There's ways that we can get information, YouTube, there's an electronic age, and pilots, tend to be a bit ADD. If it's not entertaining in the first 30 seconds, I failed on this presentation, then I'll go to sleep. Sorry about that, James. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. The instructor reference manual we'll talk about tomorrow, which is going to cover some of these details in specifics. And any other suggestions you might have? Bored you to tears? Thanks very much for your input. Thanks for everybody. I appreciate it. Did somebody get anything out of today? Did ideas get shared between instructors? Because that's what the conference is about. It's about engaging, sharing information. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neil. I've never seen someone so animated and energised and enthused about training as Neil. I've sort of got to thank my lucky stars because he's a good resource for us. Okay, so we've got some extra food over there. They've brought it out obviously because we didn't eat it all. So what I'm going to do is basically hand over, this session now is your session. We've got Paul McEwen volunteered, who's just disappeared. Where's he gone? There he is. Excellent. You see him there, you see him here. So what we're going to do as an organisation, we're going to step out of the room. You've got 3/4 of an hour. That can include a bit of a break if you want to, and I'll let Paul run that whole thing. I'll hand over to Paul now, and we'll vacate the room.